the cloud. That seems nice. All right. So what I'd like to do today is just to speak with you guys about supply side policies so that you have a rough outline of what those look like. And if you sort of think of those as being the third tool in a government's tool belt, where there's monetary policy and there's fiscal policy and there are supply side policies. And obviously there are some people who favor monetary policy and some people who favor fiscal policy and other people who push for supply side policies. Actually, though, I think we're best off if we think of these as being three things that you always need to use. So you always need to be thinking about all three of these things and how can you weave them together into a strong rope to help your country. So what you want to do is you want to divide supply side policies into two types. There are interventionist supply side policies and there are market-based supply side policies. And the biggest difference is that those interventionist supply side policies, well, obviously involve the government intervening into markets, but also those policies have the potential to shift aggregate demand, at least in the short term. All right. So for example, here we have the government can invest in human capital. The most obvious ways to invest in human capital are through education and healthcare. And so if the government spends a lot of money on education, or if the government spends a lot of money on healthcare, that is going to shift out aggregate demand in the short term. But the purpose of that spending is not to manipulate aggregate demand usually, it's to shift out aggregate supply in the long term. All right, so to move that full employment line out to give us a greater potential GDP. And the reason for this is that we're improving the capital of our people so that each person is more productive and can work more, can work longer, can work more efficiently. And just the most basic example of this is the idea of something like vaccines or of increasing your literacy. That workers who are literate are able to do so much more than workers who are illiterate. And workers who are healthy are able to come to work so much more than workers who are not able to come to work. And of course, now with us in the middle of this health crisis, we can understand that the government investing in healthcare could really shift out aggregate supply because it would allow more people to go to work if we developed a vaccine for COVID-19, for example, and that would really benefit society. That would also impact aggregate demand. The government is going to have to, governments around the world are going to spend billions and billions of dollars trying to develop this vaccine. And obviously that money goes into the economy too, and that increases the G of the C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So it is going to shift AD in the short term, but the purpose is to shift AS in the long term. Very closely related with that is also technology and the government investing in research and development. And again, this shifts aggregate demand in the short term, but in the long term, the focus is on aggregate supply. And maybe the best example of this from, well, I guess it's not quite your lifetime, but just almost, is like the World Wide Web and the internet, which is the product of government development, primarily by the US government, which has obviously kind of revolutionized the way that we communicate with each other. And so all of us right now doing this class on Zoom are benefiting from research and development that was done by governments and government spending. And that's obviously shifted out our supply because your potential education is so much better than it would have been if I was mailing you packets for you to fill out. Although maybe we'd be doing like group conference calls, but then I wouldn't be able to keep up with all of your haircuts. The government can also invest in infrastructure, ports, airports, roads. These sorts of things all help our aggregate supply move around more efficiently. I should have mentioned railroads there as well. Those are great examples of the way that the government can invest money, but that's going to make the supply more efficient, and it's going to make the moving of goods more efficient, which will lower costs, which will shift out aggregate supply. There are also specific industries that governments can focus on if they want to intervene in supply side policies. By focusing on small and medium-sized companies and by encouraging them through tax breaks or through subsidies, the government can really watch those companies grow quickly. Obviously, smaller companies have the greatest potential for growth. And also a little bit of money to many small businesses can have a big impact on their overall production and their overall efficiency. As they get slightly larger, they're going to experience greater returns on their investment. They're going to be able to experience what we call greater economies of scale. Also, the government can encourage and help what we call infant industries. Industries that aren't necessarily profitable right now, but that we hope would be profitable in the future once they get big enough and once they get large enough. So we see that at the beginning of like ethanol as an energy source, which still isn't necessarily a sustainable energy source because it takes so much energy to produce. But that was it. When that was a small industry that was heavily subsidized, the Brazilian government was actually kind of took the lead on ethanol production and then required that there be a certain amount of ethanol inside the gasoline or petrol that we use in cars in Brazil. Also, you can imagine things like renewable energy, like solar panels. There are times, like right now, oil is so cheap that it doesn't make any sense for people to switch to electric cars, because gasoline is going to be very cheap for the next 2 to 3 years. But the government could come in and could subsidize renewable energy, knowing that if we keep it now, in the future, that will drive down energy costs. So the government can kind of see beyond the immediate market realities into something larger and what might have a better longer term benefit. So those are all ways that the government can intervene but shift supply. On the other hand, there are also market-based supply side policies. And there are 3 big things that the government can do to impact the supply side just by encouraging the market. And so these then tend not to require the government to spend money. All right. On the one hand, the government can do things to encourage competition. They can get rid of some regulations that might have been keeping certain firms out of the market. And also, all regulations have an increased cost. So if we lower environmental regulations, that can increase aggregate supply. Governments can privatize businesses, because when the government privatizes businesses, that encourages more businesses to enter the market. If the government is the only owner of railroads in the country, for example, if they sell off that government stake in the railroads to several different firms, then those firms will be competitive with each other and should reach a higher level of efficiency. We can also liberalize trade. We can lower tariffs, and we can lower the taxes that we have on goods coming into our country. That's going to make our producers be more competitive, because if they don't make washing machines, for example, for cheaper prices, then they'll go out of business. So that incentivizes local firms to be more efficient, which leads to more allocative efficiency. And also they can try to break up monopolies, because monopolies have a huge advantage, and it can be very difficult for small firms to enter a market that's dominated by a monopoly. So governments can fight against monopolies to encourage competition, which is all going to shift out aggregate supply, because things will be produced more efficiently. On the other hand, the government can do policies that will increase the flexibility of labor markets. They can try to get rid of unions. They can make unions illegal in certain sectors. They can get rid of unemployment insurance, because if you have unemployment insurance, that means that there's an incentive not to work. So you can make sure that there's no unemployment insurance. You could tie healthcare to employment instead of to like a national system. That would encourage people to go out and work instead of just getting health insurance for free from the government. You can also get rid of minimum wages. Minimum wages, obviously, when we think about the supply and demand of wages, that leads to a surplus of workers who are willing to work. So if we lowered that minimum wage, we could lower unemployment, we could have more people working. So those are some of the aggressive ways that a government can move to increase flexibility in the labor market. Finally, whenever you tax something, you discourage people from doing that. And so the government can change its tax structure. We talked to this about incentive-related policies. If the government were to cut personal income taxes, that would encourage people to earn more income. If the government were to cut business taxes, that would encourage businesses to invest more of their money back into their businesses, which could make them more efficient. And then there are also, the government taxes investment in companies, which is the stock market. And money that you make in the stock market are called your capital gains. If the government lowers its capital gains taxes, well, that encourages people to invest more money in the stock market, which gives more money to companies in order for them to be able to invest that money in their product. So by encouraging competition, by increasing the flexibility in the labor market, and by changing our incentive structure, that can also shift out aggregate supply and can lead to aggregate supply shifting out. Now, I don't know which of these 7 policies appeals most to you, but some of them are necessary. We have to shift out aggregate supply. And that's true if you're a Keynesian or if you're a classical economist. Because either way, if you infinitely increase aggregate demand without increasing aggregate supply, all that's going to do is lead to an increase in the price level without an increase in GDP. So in the long run, governments need to concentrate on how to shift out supply in some way, or how to encourage private companies to shift out supply, or else we're just going to see inflation without any growth.